So the ultimate fulfillment is going to be at that time. But what God is saying is, basically, I'm giving you a time frame. I do not believe in 2 virgin births. I don't think that's the point here. He's saying, but in the time in which a virgin or a young woman would conceive and then bear a child, and then that child would grow up to an age where it understood good and evil, in that time frame, these 2 nations that you're so afraid of, they're going to be desolate. And Assyria was going to do just that. God was going to use Assyria to punish Aram and Damascus. So what this is Ahaz is being given an opportunity to place his faith in Jehovah God. Jehovah God is saying, I am going to deliver you. I've said this, and this is not even conditional. Ahaz doesn't have to change his ways. He doesn't have to repent. God is going to deliver His people. But this does give Ahaz an opportunity to turn back to God, understanding here are the blessings that come from Jehovah. And so what does Ahaz do? Going back to our text in 2 Chronicles 28. At that time, King Ahaz sent to the kings of Assyria for help. The text will go on to say how this, in fact, was not a help to Ahaz. In fact, it was an affliction to Ahaz. Now, it does not mean that the Assyrians did not do what Ahaz was wanting. You look at the historical records, it actually looks like Assyria kind of took their time about it, but ultimately they did go, they did defeat Damascus, they did defeat Samaria. They did what Ahaz asked. The siege of Jerusalem was lifted, the people were spared, all this happens. But what does Ahaz have to do to secure Assyria's help? What do any of these smaller kingdoms have to do if they want the help of Assyria? Pay tribute. And by the way, that's not just a one-time monetary payment. Oh, hey, we could use some help. I'm going to send you some money. Use your troops, and you can keep the money. By the way, where did he get the money from? Temple. Loots the temple to be able to pay tribute to the Assyrian king. But what this does is then puts Ahaz in subjugation to Assyria. Judah doesn't fall. They're still a kingdom, if you will. But they're now under the rule of Assyria. They are now going to be expected to remain faithful to Assyria. And we'll talk about how that kind of has some ramifications during the days of Hezekiah when we get to Hezekiah's reign. But to remain under the rule and authority of Assyria, you didn't pay tribute one time, you paid tribute every year, however so often that the Assyrians demanded this tribute. So the text says, again, this was not a help to Ahaz, this was actually an affliction to Ahaz. And furthermore, Ahaz just departed further and further from the ways of God. Going back to 2 Chronicles 28, it begins to talk about what happened after this time. And so it says in verse 19, the Lord humbled Judah because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he had brought about a lack of restraint in Judah and was very unfaithful to the Lord. And then you read in verse 20 how the king of Assyria afflicted Ahaz instead of strengthening him. Skip down to verse 22. In the time of his distress, this same king Ahaz became yet more unfaithful to the Lord. And the chronicler notes how Ahaz began worshiping the gods of Damascus. Now, this is an interesting thing that I don't really have an answer for. Ahaz reasons that the gods of Damascus were more powerful than his God. And his reasoning is because, well, Aram had been sorely afflicting him, so their gods must be powerful. Of course, if he had only turned to Jehovah God, he would have understood real power. But Damascus itself had just been defeated. They had just been defeated by the Assyrians. So that's the question I don't have an answer to. I don't know why Ahaz says, I'm going to worship the gods of Damascus, instead of, I'm surprised he didn't say, I'm going to worship the gods of Nineveh, because they have now proven themselves to be the dominant power. But here's where the account in Kings adds even more details. Because Ahaz at one point will travel north and meet Tiglath-Pileser III, show his loyalty, show his subjugation. Maybe this is even how he pays the tribute at this time. And while he's there, he sees an altar. He sees an altar in Damascus. And what does he want done? Yeah. So he sends the plans for it. Sends the plans for it back to the priests in Jerusalem and says, we're going to build a new altar. Now there's already an altar, right? There's an altar right outside the temple. Altar where all the sacrifices are made to God. What do they do with that altar? Kind of move it aside, replace it with this new altar. And this new altar is where all the sacrifices are going to be made. But King Ahaz says, I'm still going to use that old altar, but what's he going to use that old altar for? Definitely a pagan practice. Which pagan practice? Divination. Most likely what we are to conclude from that is to be one of those things where you sacrifice an animal, you would have done so on the altar, and then you start inspecting the liver and other things to try to find out what the future holds. Well, this is another one of those practices that God has forbidden in His law, God has forbidden His people to do, and it just shows a continuing lack of faith and trust in Jehovah God. So let's go back to Isaiah one more time. Ahaz had been promised, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to deliver you. You don't have to fear. I'm even going to give you a sign. But he has not turned to Jehovah God. So move on to chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 1. The Lord speaks to Isaiah again. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about Isaiah Wednesday night. I am not going to try to do a one-lesson synopsis of Isaiah. I'm not that crazy. We're not going to try to do that. We will see how Isaiah kind of fits into the reigns of several kings. And so we've begun here with Ahaz. But it is interesting. You just begin to piece various pieces of Isaiah in with the historical context. So, for instance, when Isaiah is called in chapter 6, and we're left with this impression of the glory and the majesty of God, and Isaiah sees this glory and this majesty, and he declares himself to be undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. Well, think of that in the context of the kings of Judah at that time. There's not a lot of majesty and glory in the kings of Judah at that time. This is a kingdom in decline. But Isaiah is faced with the ruler of the universe, and now he beholds real glory, real majesty. Coming to chapter 8, the Lord said to me, "Take for yourself a large tablet, and write on it in ordinary letters, 'Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey.' And I'll take to myself faithful witnesses for testimony, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeber." Yeah, I'm not gonna butcher his name today. Now note what he does next. And this may be the temporal fulfillment of what we read back in chapter 7. This is at least a possibility. "So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said to me, 'Name him Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz.' Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. For before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So again, you would see, just reading that would seem to fit that promise back in chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. And so Isaiah and his wife, the prophetess, they are the temporal fulfillment of that. Don't misunderstand me. The real fulfillment, ultimate fulfillment, God delivering by miraculous virgin birth, that's Jesus. But this temporal fulfillment in this time frame, that's happening now. So we have this. That looks good. That sounds great. But then you continue on, beginning in verse 5. Again, the Lord spoke to me further, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, and rejoiced in Rezin and the son of Remaliah. And the idea there is at the fall of Rezin. That is at the fall of Syria and the fall of Aram. They're rejoicing in this. Oh yes, everything's great. Therefore, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates. Even the king of Assyria in all his glory. It will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck. And the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. The Assyrians, who would be the ones who would defeat the Arameans, would defeat the Israelites, now God says, they're coming to Judah too. The land of Emmanuel. They're going to overflow it. So I think even there you see the necessity of that second and ultimate fulfillment. Because God's people, this isn't going to be good times for them. Real deliverance is going to come in the days of the true Emmanuel. Okay, that's what I've got this morning. Any other questions, comments? Brother Steve, please.
The one thing is, as you study this and you see the kings, and I think it's most evident here, is you have Jotham, who's a good king. You have Ahaz, who's a horrible king. You have Hezekiah, who's a good king. So you have a grandfather, a father, and a son. And it's Ezekiel 18 that people say that the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And God says, no, a good man lives a good life, he'll live. He has a bad son, the bad son's going to pay for his sin. And oh, by the way, if he has a good son, a grandson, and he lives righteously, he will live. And this is being lived out in the southern kingdom, the progression of kings. That a good man will have a bad son.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good point, making that tie between Ezekiel 18 and these kings. I didn't spell out an application. I think it's pretty clear. I hope we all see it. Times of tribulation, times of distress, that's a call to greater faith. It's not a call to abandon faith. It's a call to greater faith. And it may also be a call to look at, as Jesus says in Luke 13, repent lest you all likewise perish. There may be a call for me to repent in my time of tribulation. I don't know. You have to look at that situation yourself. But you see these times of great affliction among God's people, and God is holding out hope. Here's what I can do. I can deliver you. Have faith in me. And Ahaz is a clear example of someone who went further from his faith in God. All right. Thank you, everyone. We will continue on Wednesday.